The 144,000. Now, some people have made a big deal out of these numbers. I'm not saying it's not a big deal. Obviously, there's some issues here with interpreting this. If you've been following me on Revelation, or you've done any study of on the book of Revelation, you, by this point in the text, you are not intimidated by numbers. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I think it becomes pretty clear that everything in Revelation, especially if you've been following here, everything's not, what meets the eye. Not everything is written plainly. And this is in keeping with biblical history. Biblical history, God is, he gives riddles. He wants you to dive into his teachings and work for them. And those who have no interest in working for them, things will remain hidden. And they will say to themselves, well, God wouldn't do that. Well, they're wrong. God would do that. God is looking for people to worship him in spirit and in truth. And that requires ciphering the riddles of the wise, and God is wise. So in the book of Revelation, for those who are trying to understand God's ways, trying to understand God's teachings, you accept that some things need to be ciphered. Jesus was like this. It is a common biblical pattern. 144,000 does not intimidate Christians that have trying to understand the book of Revelation. We see it the way we see the numerology of the Old Testament, and it's right here in the New Testament. And there's so many prophetic themes continuing, including all the way up to the genre and writing style, that there's no reason to be surprised by the numerology. So a lot of these, I won't be too specific here, but cults that would say, this is a specific number, 144,000. Whew, that is some pretty bad hermeneutics. It's gonna go. There's no good reason to believe that this is specifying a person. Now, it's tempting though, and I'll tell you why it's tempting. Because it's so mystical. Yes, God has chosen this very, very specific number. And this specific number, God's going to do something specific with. This goes back to my last Revelation video, where I kind of picked up on this idea that if you really want to honor God, and you really want to, you should be trying to understand the authorial intent and trying to understand that God inspired this author and try to respect the author's desires for what you would understand. All right, so we're going to continue to do that. Now, so this is Revelation 7. All right, and you have the 144,000. Now, there's something very peculiar that happens right away. A tribe is omitted from this list of the 12 tribes of Israel. Tribe is omitted, and that tribe is the tribe of Dan. Now, rabbinic scholars have said that Dan fell into apostasy, and in fact, Abraham seemed to prophesy something like this. Okay, so that seems like a very good reason to believe that Dan would not be included in this list of 12. Well, why not? Well, 12 is cubed here, okay? And so that's the number 10. So 12,000 from the tribe, 12,000 from this tribe, 12,000 from that tribe. I don't think the author means for us to take that literally. He's speaking to us. He's trying to get us to cipher here. And it's the number 10. And the number 10 is this number of fullness. So the fullness of the 12 tribes of Israel, the fullness of Israel, which would not include Dan. Because Dan perhaps is the tribe that the Antichrist comes from. So there's still a lot of speculation to be done here, okay? But It's significant that they're omitted. And it's significant that the number is 12,000. Okay? So that would mean the complete tribes of Israel. That would be actual Israel. Now, there is, I'm not going to get too far into the weeds on this. Maybe in the future I'll do a video on it. I'm not sure. On how the church is the true Israel. There's a lot of evidence for this in the Bible. Obviously, mainly in the New Testament. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but there are some interesting parallels going on here. For one, what would make these tribes of Israel complete? Well, they would have to submit themselves to Christ. There's just no getting around that. There's no getting around it. That is the judgment that the whole book of Revelation is based on. We've already discussed it. So if it's going to be the complete tribes of Israel, they are going to be submitting themselves to the person of Christ. So I have emphasized that geography is fairly trivial when we're thinking about the gospel. Why? Well, because the message is going worldwide. It doesn't matter whether you worship on this mountain or that, spirit or in truth. I'm sorry, worship in spirit and in truth. That's who God is looking for. But we can't take the Israel out of Israel, right? When he talks about these tribes, they're based in Israel. So when you get past that, let's get zany here for a minute and look at right when you get to verse 9. It says, "After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number from every nation." So, from all tribes and peoples and languages standing before the throne and before the Lamb. So when it comes to salvation, when it comes to the future, what land mass you're on doesn't matter. And I'm sorry, I know a lot of people really hang their hats on the land of Israel. And I just want to tell you, I just have yet, through all my studies, have not found a particular landmass to be all that important to God in the end of time here, in the latter days. Latter days, that gets into some areas, but you know what I mean. When we get into the end times, and I believe the end times is now, the issue is the gospel and not a particular landmass. And that makes things much clearer. So why this emphasis on the land of Israel? Well, it's to describe the people group. It's to describe the actual scope of the gospel. So the land of Israel, the gospel is going to affect God's people who their identity is in that land. But God wants to affect their hearts, okay? And then the identity of Gentiles is everyone else who's not of that landmass. All tribes, all nations. Why didn't it get more specific about other lands? It doesn't need to. So it's not, even though it's using landmass to discuss everything that's going on, it's to focus on the land is a big mistake, okay? It's focusing on these people. So clearly in this vision, he sees in the throne room those who finally in Israel, Jews that will be saved, right? And then from every tribe and nation. Now, here's where we get really, really zany. The implications, this is so interesting. The implications from every tribe, tongue, and nation and so forth, that they go through a process that's very similar to what we see in the wilderness and Exodus, is really interesting. And again, harkens back to and speaks to the idea that the church is the true Jews. Again, way too much to talk about here. Way too much. I can't do it. Maybe I could go through sometime some of the passages and show. And look, you may have objections to that. Okay. I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I want to read this to you. This is the very end of chapter 7 of Revelation. In 13, it says, "Then one of the elders addressed me, saying, 'Who are these clothed in white robes? And from where have they come?'" Right? So where did they come from? I said to him, Sir, you know. And he said to me, These are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. Not where location, where in historical events. What's the great tribulation? That could be now. Just think about that for a minute, but it gets better. All right. So not where landmass, but where events in history. All right. Coming out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. All right. Now, this is where we get to the possibility that this is paralleling the Exodus account to some, at least to some degree. Okay. So this is good. So then it goes into this sort of cadence. All right. So almost like this is, I don't want to mess up my terminology here, but your copy of the Bible here in Revelation 7:15 through 17 might have a special well, heck, let's just put it up there. Why not? See how it has special indentations. Okay. So a lot of times, sometimes that indicates poetry of some kind, or maybe a mantra, or whatever the case. I don't know. I'm having a hard time finding the word for it, and it's quoted here. So I don't know. It appears this is a quote. This is when the elder sang this. Okay, and this elder says this: "Therefore they are before the throne of God and serve Him." And who are these people? It appears to be from the 12 tribes and of every nation, right? So therefore they are before the throne of God and serve Him day and night in His temple, right? So Israel, they come out of Egypt and they go, and what do they ultimately do in the land of Israel? They make a temple to God. That's what all these people do. And He who sits on the throne will shelter them with His presence. They shall hunger no more, neither thirst no more. Now, what is this? This is the hope that the people of Israel had for going to the land of Israel. Not directly, right? They understood it was a land overflowing with milk and honey, is what we're told. But you're seeing this, right? This is sort of this getting back to the Garden of Eden, which is how the book of Revelation will end, by the way. Really interesting. Okay, so, nor any scorching heat. And then 17, for the Lamb is in the midst of the throne. For the Lamb in the midst of the throne will be their shepherd, right? So God shepherded the people of Israel, of Jews, from Egypt into the land of Israel. And it says, and He will guide them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Now, living water harkens back to when Jesus was talking to the woman at the well, and He said, you won't thirst anymore. I will give you living water. And she says, well, give me this living water so I don't have to keep coming back to this well. And she's seen, by the way, and this is a fascinating text, because she's seen as being very dense. That's the way it reads. But the thing is she saw Jacob's well as an act of like a holy pilgrimage. And that to go to that well, I think, was to do something spiritual. So it's possible when she says to Jesus, give me this living water so I don't have to go back to this well, that she's saying, she's kind of on the level a little bit, to use some older terminology, on the level, but she might be a little bit. You know, the idea here is, give me this so I don't have to keep coming back here. She understood that Jacob's well was significant. So what's the living water? The living water is, you don't have to go to a particular place to be right with God. And yet, what do we have? News about what's going on in Israel, right? As if the Bible's focused on the land of Israel when it talks about the land of Israel, when it's not always focused on the land of Israel. I understand that this is not convenient with some millennial views. That's why I have the millennial view that I have. Does it mean that I'm right and they're wrong? No, not necessarily, right? There could be very good arguments against what I'm saying. I am simply saying, for what I'm looking at here in the book of Revelation, this seems to be the best interpretation I've come across. Have a good one.